Greetings to you all. Today, a fairly short video on surrealism and Dada. What is Dada? You are asking, and Tristan Zara is laughing at you because you've just fallen into a trap. More on that later. So I guess in a broad sense, what we've been doing so far in these videos is exploring a reaction to the Enlightenment, to the whole notion of the age of reason and its basic principles. Let's remind ourselves that those principles are still core to work that we do in the science laboratory and technology, engineering, and so on. But in the humanities, broadly speaking, in our field, shall we say, of the arts, philosophy, and literature, yeah, we're tracing a kind of reaction to that notion of reason. We saw it with Romanticism, we saw it with symbolism, with modernism. And in the last two videos, we were looking at two plays which sort of gesture us towards the absurd, moving us in that direction. It's a matter of interpretation how absurd these plays are. But if we take Albert Camus' understanding of the absurd, what have we got? We've got the human being attempting to make meaning out of a meaningless world. That's it for Camus. So if you read his Myth of Sisyphus, any of his other works, you will find that basic idea repeating itself over and over again. We cannot help but try and make sense of our world, and good luck with that. That's his philosophy, that's his position. It's some way distant from existentialism, but that's not the subject of this course. And I mean, Camus, I think, would say, well, there's no reason why we can't have fun along the way, right? And there's no reason why we should not act with dignity and respect to others. But this is what characterizes the absurd world. I don't know if Travesties is in that sense an utterly absurd play, because after all, we do have that anchor at the end in old Cecily, his wife, who informs us about the actual facts. And it's as though we have that frame still that we can kind of grasp hold of. But you know, that's a matter of interpretation. But in that video, and I think in the one that I did on Oscar Wilde too, I sort of threw at you the term surrealism and Dada, and it seems appropriate that we explore that a little more, not least because of its interesting treatment of memory, which of course is the main theme of this course. One of the key works for anybody wanting to get into surrealism is called a Manifesto of Surrealism. It's come to us from André Breton, and I think it was first published in 1924. Let's just have a look at André, if we can find him here. There he is, looking appropriately silly. I like the surrealists because they're just very silly. So in this manifesto, among other things, he sets out his disgust, his repugnance for the whole notion of memory, strictly speaking. He coined the phrase, il y aura une fois. Now, I am no French scholar, believe me, but I've read the translation of that is once upon a time there will be. And so what we've got is this kind of formulaic fairy tale phrase, once upon a time, which is juxtaposed with this really abrupt shift of tense into the future. That's very characteristic of what the surrealists are up to. They're kind of detonating conventional notions of temporal time, of chronology. This is what they are sort of fighting against here. And part and parcel of that was a rejection of any sort of rational, episodic understanding of memory. I think the word aleatory is helpful. It's actually in the course outline. I describe this part of what we're doing as aleatory memory. Aleatory means random, chance, unexpected, contingent, whatever word you want to use. That's basically what aleatory means. And I think that almost best describes the surrealist understanding of memory as something which is just utterly random, but importantly associated with dreamlike states. So let's just clarify what's happening here. Unlike the Romantics, surrealists do not construe memory events as, you know, emotional episodes that we've had in the past that we relive by having the same emotions down the track. So that's out the window as far as surrealists are concerned. Unlike symbolists, they do not consider memory to be dependent on triggers, sensual triggers, olfactory, gustatory, tactile, whatever, and whether voluntarily induced or not. No, that's gone out the window. And unlike the early modernists, like Joyce and Virginia Woolf, they don't buy into this idea of tunneling, of kind of episodes that you can decode or retrieve down the track by associations and connecting things up. No, I mean, they don't go along with that either, apart from anything else. It's still past predicated in many ways, or too far for them. They don't go along with the Proustian idea that there is some kind of capsule of time that you can access if you're lucky, or train yourself to do. So all of that's kind of, you know, rather, I think the surrealist representation of memory has the arbitrary, chaotic, random, let's say aleatory nature of a dream state. And that totally obliterates any sense of a unifying logic or coherence to what a memory might be. The past mingles into the chaotic, jumble, montage-like imagery of the present and the future, just in a mishmash. And in some respects, you could argue that we've already seen an example of this with Carr, with Old Man Carr, because our experience of the play excuse me, is an experience of confabulation, and confabulation, I think, is a surrealist understanding of memory in dream. It's like he's in a dream state, right? And we talked about that in the last in the last video. It might help us just to consider other forms of surrealist work. And I'm thinking of painting. So Breton, in another work called Le Surréalisme et la Peinture, argues that surrealist poetry and painting have the same principles and the same techniques. So we're sort of moving beyond cubism, which is sort of stretching the third dimension with its cubes and its cones and so on, and moving into what Minkowski calls, Hermann Minkowski, the fourth dimension. So he talks about the fourth dimension in a work called Space and Time, which came out in 1908. And I can't think of a better way to get into it than to look at Salvador Dali's work. Here's the man himself, with his fabulous moustaches. I read once that somebody went to interview him down in where he was in Spain, I think, and he put honey on the tips of his moustaches, and there were just bees and flies just all around him, and he just sat there with a big smile on his face. I love that. I hope it's true, that story. So here is his painting, very famous, which is called The Persistence of Memory. So obviously apposite to us and what we're doing in this course. And I think this was done in 1931. And Dali talked about this painting and referred to it as illustrating the camembert of time. Now, camembert, if you don't know, is a soft French cheese. It's cheesy time, ladies and gentlemen. That's what we've got here. So, yeah, I mean, we've got a sort of representation of time which is stretching and melting. You may have other words here, but against a kind of robust solidity represented by the rocks and these kind of hard granite or stone-like forms and wood-like forms. So the picture in that sense can be seen as a representation or a simulacrum of a kind of dreamlike state in which time is in flux, it's fluid, it's well, it's just hanging around on a tree, isn't it? Yeah, you know, it's something you all know about, but it's worth reminding yourself, ourselves, of just what an arbitrary thing time is, or what a slippery little sucker it is. The moment you actually start trying to define it, you're going to get into all sorts of trouble because you're going to end up having to use metaphors. And okay, so, you know, the question you might then have, if we're going to try and use it as an organizing principle for human behavior, is what do we set time to? And of course the general answer historically has been the sun, and you end up with sundials, which are all very well, but you know, they're pretty naff, aren't they? It kind of depends on whether there's any shadow that you can see. It wasn't until the early 14th century that we had the first mechanical clock. This is in Salisbury Cathedral. 1336 is when, this is 1386, when this was put together. That's the mechanism. And the face of it's absolutely fabulous. Look at that. But yeah, I mean, just in terms of practical life and traveling, how would you do it in a way that's to sort of organize it and liaise with anyone else you know who you are traveling to meet with? Station masters at railway stations used to just go out on the platform at midday and set the time locally to the position of the sun, or you know, however they construed that. So it was just chaotic. For example, on the railways, you know, the time in Newcastle in England would be different from the time in Bradford, or time in Watford, or Norwich, or Plymouth, or London. And this was, I came across this sort of comic representation in Punch from the early 19th century, which is just nonsense, and it's meant to be nonsense. I think most of these names at the top are made up, except for London, of course. And it's just lampooning and making fun of the complexity of train timetables with all the shit going on, and in particular, these different time zones across such a small sort of, you know, space. It wasn't until 1847 that they got their act together and came up with Greenwich Mean Time, which was often referred to as railway time. So that was just a little tangent there, but you can see the joke that Dali's having here with this. There is memory here. The memory is of his childhood playing on the beaches in the Cadiquet, which is just outside Marseille in the south of France. And it is a place that he returned to with his wife, had happy times there. So, you know, the actual rock cliff structure at the back and the sea, the coastline, is a sort of accurate semblance of a place and therefore a time for Dali. It's just kind of morphing with or juxtaposing or conflating with this much more fluid contextual notion of time. And we have to do with this juxtaposition images that themselves challenge us in terms of their positioning and in terms of their substance. I mean, this fish-like thing at the bottom here is and isn't. It's very difficult to describe what that is. We've got what seems to be a concrete structure in the top left hanging in the air, although that could just be a section of the sea. We've got a tree stump-ish type thing and a box. God alone knows what this flask is on the left. But I think one of the things that can help us here to sort of unpack what we're seeing is that linguistic matrix that de Saussure gives us, and that I keep referring you to, the signifying chain, the symbolic chain, because that's key to the game being played by surrealists, as we will see in a couple of poems in a moment. And it's really helpful, I think, to keep that in your mind. They are messing with your signifiers, whether you like it or not. I mean, take that fish-like form. I don't even know what the signifier is. I suppose the signifier is what I'm seeing, all right? But what happens in microseconds when we see stuff is we have to label it. We have to put it into words. That's basic Wittgenstein, right? I mean, I do this with my English 100 students. I mean, Wittgenstein would say, okay, you go to a doctor and you say, doctor, I've got a pain in my stomach. What is the doctor going to ask you to do? The answer is describe it. You've got to describe it. So how do you describe your pain? You're going to have to find what? You're going to have to find a metaphor or a simile, an adjective. You're going to have to say something like, you know, it feels like I've swallowed a gallon of cold milk this morning and I can't get rid of it. Or it feels like somebody just stabbed me with a penknife. And now the doctor can start to begin the diagnosis. But Wittgenstein's point is you don't have an ulcer or you don't have cancer or whatever until you find the metaphor that takes you there. This is how utterly dependent we are on language, on signifiers. And when they start getting messed around with, as we've seen progressively in these videos, right? I mean, it begins with the importance of being earnest. When we start looking at something, we still have the same problem because we've still got to process what we see in language. And you and I, right now, are having that problem, trying to sort of label and describe what we're looking at here. So again, there is memory here, but it's not in a way that can be fixed or clearly identified. It is mediated. It is mediated in this very confusing way. I mean, look, what we have here is the visual representation of a memory, of a dream-like memory. I think that's the point. Now, this sense of playing with time is found throughout surrealist literature. There is a short story by Guillaume Apollinaire, who died 1819, I think. He was injured in the First World War. And it's called La Fiancée Posthume. And it's about a couple who are grieving the loss of their 5-year-old daughter. But the form of their grieving is that they don't actually accept the loss, so that the memory of the dead girl is not given the status of a memory. She lives. This is reminding me of Jaspers's forms of delusion that we talked about in an earlier video. And it becomes increasingly chronic as you go through the story. So by the time she's sort of 16 years old, they decide that she's, heading towards marrying age, and they ought to sort of fix her up. So they advertise for a lodger, and they interview lodgers, these guys who come to the house to live with them. And the basic premise is whether she would like them, whether they would be suitable as a husband for our daughter. And we have these really bizarre conditionals and hypotheticals as we sort of read through this story. Here's a nice example. She would be 16 years old. Who knows? Our lodger would please her, perhaps, like that. So what happens is that the lodger then falls in love with the mother. It's all very wonderfully French and kind of messy and funny in that way. But the memory here, insofar as it is a memory, is conflated into a living, active, dream-like state. And it's very disorientating to the readers because, we are bereft of, it's absent of any sequential process. This is, if you like, a radical time slip. It's kind of time slips without the handrails. You just kind of, what's going on? Apollinaire also experiments with time in his long poem called Zone. I think I have a picture of him somewhere. Let's have a look. Yep, there he is. So this poem is a nighttime walk through Paris, and the poet is in a dreamlike state, and we have sort of radical shifts between the first person I, third person, and second person two. The two seems to represent his childhood presence, but it's quite disorientating. In one passage, he's walking through an industrial zone, hence Zone, the title of the poem, of Paris. And this is a quote. He says, "This morning I saw a pretty street, whose name I forgot. Here is the young street, and you are still only a little child." And it's very disorientating and sort of tricky to read. The work called Communicating Vessels by Breton, which came out in 1931, explores automatic writing, which is often called psychography. And this is how surrealists explored writing and poetry as formed in that sort of trance-like state between sleep and wake, between consciousness and unconsciousness. And it was often a sort of game they would play. They would meet together and they would, perhaps using hypnosis or perhaps using forms of substances that they would take or imbibe, they would try to get themselves into these states and then explore what the text is, or whatever happens to transpire. I mean, one of the ways of doing it would be to fall asleep holding a bottle or a glass, and then as you fall, the glass will drop and smash and make a noise. You instantly come, and then you start writing. So this is one of the ways they would try and do it. And as a result of one of these games they were playing, or explorations, we have the famous phrase, "the exquisite corpse drinks the new wine. So that's something that somebody wrote down in this trance-like state, and you have a serialist poem. That's basically what that's how you can construct it. I actually explored this the other day and came up with this definition of what it is and how you might go about doing it. So look at this. Automatic writing is an old form of divination in which messages seem to come out of nowhere through your hand and onto paper. Some who have attempted this form of mediumship have written lengthy messages, songs, even complete novels. I'm not sure about that. Anyway, difficulty hard. Time required 15 minutes to an hour. So here's a way of doing it. You find a quiet spot without distractions. Sit at a table or desk where you're comfortable with paper and pen or pencil. Take a few moments to clear your mind. Touch the pen or pencil to the paper. Try not to consciously write anything. And while keeping your mind as clear as possible, let your hand write whatever comes across. Avoid looking at the paper. You might even keep your eyes closed. Give it time to happen. Nothing might happen for quite a while. And when it seems to be done, if and when automatic writing does occur, look over what your hand has produced carefully. The writing may appear to be nonsense or just scribbling, but try to decipher it as best as possible. In addition to letters and numbers, look for pictures or symbols in the writing as well. Keep trying. Nothing might happen your first few attempts. If you start to achieve success, you can try asking questions to see if you can receive responses. And here are some tips. There's no guarantee that automatic writing will work for you, but don't give up. If it doesn't work the first few times, give it a chance. And be aware of psychological dangers. Some messages that come across might be disturbing. If you're not at all not able to handle this possibility, don't attempt automatic writing. What you need is a pencil or pen, a paper, and a large bottle of whiskey. There we are. I'm not sure that the serialists that I've been talking to you about were quite as serious about this endeavor. And that takes me to Tristan Tzara and to Dada. Part of the problem with this explanation, it seems to me, and it's something that I think Tzara would say, is this idea that we should, that there's going to be a meaning that we should try and find, using rational categories here. Dada resists that attempt to find a meaning. It's not without meaning. I think that's important to understand. Dada is not nihilism. And it, in a sense, it even has a social activist dimension to it. So this is the point at which I refer you to a little video clip I'm going to post for you, 4 or 5 minutes long, but it's a really good, I think, quick examination and illustration of what Dada is. And you have Tzara himself with a little Dada poem at the end. So, yeah, and you'll see from that video that this is not, utterly absurdism. It's not nihilism. There is a kind of reason behind it. It's just challenging us to find meaning in non-conventional ways. And the way that at the beginning of the play Travesties, Tzara is just flinging out these words from a hat and sort of creating poetry in that way is bound to offend the traditionalist, right, like Joyce. But it's intended to be a critique, a social critique, a rejection of previous forms. And the play, I think, wonderfully sets out that argument about art and the status of art that I took you to at the end of the last video. So, how best to analyze surrealist Dada works, whether they be photographic or whether they be poetic or painting? How should we do it? Number one, I think we need to look out for spontaneous juxtapositions. Number 2, startling reversals. Number 3, puzzling metaphors. Metaphors where the tenor and the vehicle don't connect. So a bit of revision here, right? So a metaphor has a tenor and a vehicle. I may have already done this in a previous video with you guys. Let's use the one I always use as it comes to my mind. He is a pig, all right, tenor, vehicle. You unpack the metaphor by exploring the properties of the vehicle, piggishness. You have all these images, and then they are projected back onto the tenor. So when we try and do that with surrealism, it's often very difficult to unpack because the signifiers are not behaving as they should, as we'll see when we turn to a couple of poems. Chaos, randomness, given voice. This is a poem by Antonin Artaud, who died in 1948. Who am I? Well, we're back to this question of subject identity, which is sort of threading throughout our course, isn't it? Because it sort of imports into it notions of memory and of how we construe our past. So who am I? Where am I from? I'm Antonin Artaud. And since I speak as I know, in a moment you'll see my present body shattered to pieces and gather itself in 1,000 notorious aspects, a fresh body in which you'll never be able to forget me. I think this is a fabulous little poem. And it turns, I think, on 2 words, signifiers. So we have this question and a challenge, in a sense, who am I and where am I from? We have a statement of present identity, a name, a label, Antonin Artaud. And this subject speaks, as I know, in a moment. Now, the word moment is problematic because it can signify different things, right? In a moment could be now, an articulation of present, something in the present. But it can also be in a moment. So you have a phrasal notion here of something future predicated, and it's a conflation of time. This is what tends to happen, right, in surrealist writing. It's radical time slips. So we have something shattering, which suggests dying or becoming extinguished, and then gathering itself. So that's just a morphing, a rebirth, a recreation into something. 1,000 notorious. Notorious suggests well-known, perhaps not, well-known, celebrated, but perhaps not applauded, but still well-known aspects. And now we have that other key word, which causes problems for us on the signifying chain, because an aspect can be a vista, a facet, a prospect, but it can also be a grammatical construction of time. And so it's unclear, or rather we have these different signifieds conflating with each other at the same time, and it's unclear which one we should follow. Oh, excuse me. Into a fresh body in which you'll never be able to forget me. And so now there is the challenge to us. The poem is pitched to us. And the link is made between Antonin and us. So what might he be at the end here? What has he become? How do we answer the 2 questions at the beginning? And it's almost as though the poet himself is melding into the thousand notorious aspects that he refers to here of his craft. And what is his craft? What does he do? He writes. So these thousand aspects can now perhaps signify words. And we arrive at, I think, the rather wonderful and startling, puzzling metaphor. I am antoninato, okay, and now I am poet. So I am text. I am poem. And each time we look at the vehicle of the metaphor and unpack it, explore it. So what are the properties or qualities of poetic text? Well, we have the juxtaposition of signifiers which can be abstract and confusing. We have text which is read by others, right? And all of this is I, and I is antonym. It's as though he's saying, I'm dead and I am alive. Time is conflating even as we read this poem. Every time someone reads these words, I am embodied. And the result here, I don't think is absurd. I think that it's not absurd in the Camus sense. There is meaning to be found here. It just resides outside of conventional forms, structures, and thoughts. The lovely thing about this poem is that the poet Antoninato died. He died in 1948, and he's with us right now. He's with us right now. And that's what he's saying to us. The poem brings him to life. If we look at the next poem, I think we have something very similar going on here. This is by Apollinaire. And as I say to all my students, I mean, the first thing you do when you get anything, put in front of you is just look at the print, just look at the organization of the text here. And there are these two, there's this word always and to lose, top and bottom just separated out. I mean, so the poem is sort of turning on the juxtaposition of those two statements, and we have the title too, always. So we're going to have to sort of make sense of that. Always to lose suggests something utterly depressing and deflating and sad, and we always lose. But is that actually what the poet is saying here? We will go further without ever progressing, and from planet to planet, from nebula onto nebula, Don Juan of comets 1,003, without even leaving the Earth. Search for new forces, take phantoms seriously, and in this world so many forgotten, whoever they are, the great forgetters, who will know how to make us forget some part of the world or other. Where is Columbus, to whom we owe a continent's forgetting? To lose, but to lose in truth, to make place for the newly known. There is a sense of movement here. This idea of going further and further and exploring and discovering. But at the same time, it's a stasis. Without even leaving the Earth. And so we've got that strange juxtaposition or reversal, if you like, happening. Movement, and then it isn't movement. We have a metaphor here which is tricky, isn't it? Don Juan of comets. Don Juan is a famous lover in literature. So what do we do with that? maybe the idea is in a sense life-affirming. If you think about a comet and what it looks like, you have this kind of trail of spectral dust or light, which you may have an image of seed, of sperm tracing across the sky, which would connect now to the great lover, Don Juan. So that's something that's kind of life-affirming here. And I think that in some respects, if we try to hook up always losing and the life-affirming notion of the poem, we arrive perhaps at some interpretation that what he seems to be saying is that, in a sense, we lose the past by making it past, by labeling it. So we're back to that signifying thing again. This is how we lose. And we do this, we make the past past so that we can live now in the moment in a way that will make sense to us. And we repeat this mistake, thinking that it's knowledge or progress. And I think that's the point about this stanza, the penultimate stanza, and the references to the great forgetters and the Columbus. We're sort of conjoined to think chronologically and temporally in a way that actually means we lose shit, we lose stuff. And we always have that sense of losing. But it's only because we have such a limited understanding of the word lose and a limited understanding of the word past. Once we free ourselves from those conventional signifieds, we can find a new truth, a new knowledge. And losing is not losing anymore. It's become something else. All we need to do to cope and progress is to drop conventional signifieds of past and now and loss. And that, I think, is a nice segue into the last poem I want to look at by Tristan Tzara, because I think he's kind of doing the same thing with signifieds here. This was written as a sort of paean to the death of Apollinaire. A sort of eulogy. We know nothing of grief. The bitter season of cold ploughs long furrows in our muscles. He would have rather enjoyed delight in victory, we wise beneath calm sorrows, caged, unable to do a thing. If the snow fell upwards, if the sun rose among us during the night to warm us, and the trees hung there in a wreath, the only tear. If the birds were among us to be mirrored in the tranquil lake above our heads, we might understand. Death would be a long and beautiful voyage and an endless holiday for the flesh, for structure, for bone. I think you hopefully now have the tools to unpack this, to get what he's saying, right? Just think about reversals. This is a poem that, like the previous ones, is trying to reconfigure the signifying or symbolic chain as we conventionally use it. Truth is to be found in the reversals of that, okay? And so if we take the signifier death, Tzara is saying, what are we doing, guys? Why are we just launching into all those signifieds that are conventional, which are associated with winter and wintry and loss and unhappiness and sadness? Why didn't we just flip everything upside down, including everything we see around us? And we'll arrive at a new understanding of what death can mean. Understanding, I think, for surrealists like Dada, just needs to be relocated. And then, in this case, We haven't lost our dear friend Guillaume. He's with us now. This is something to be celebrated because we've found a new truth. We've found a new seeing, a new understanding. Again, I don't think this is absurdism. And I don't think this is nihilistic. It's just very challenging. But also, I think, in a lovely and at times very beautiful way. The last poem I'm not going to read or analyze. I just thought I'd put it in here because it's so gorgeous. It's a surrealist love poems by Robert Denot, who died in 1945. So I think if you care to, you might just have a quick read and enjoy that. But it's the same basic idea. You've got surprising reversals and a conflation of space-time very much happening in this poem, which takes us into Minkowski's fourth dimension. Okay, so do whatever you do. Check out the little video clip I'm sending to you, because a lot of what I've said in this video will make more sense when you just spend 4 or 5 minutes doing that. And in the final video before our midterm, we will turn to figurative and mythical time and the labyrinths of Jorge Luis Borges and an extraordinary story, The Garden of Forking Paths. So, see you then. Thank you for your time.